Okay, it's on. We're going to get started. We have plenty of time today. Thanks very much to all of you for joining us. My name is Amanda Lewis. I'm the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy here at UIC. For those of you who don't know who we are, IRRPP's mission is to improve the quality, quantity, and impact of research on race and policy, and to help serve UIC's mission as an urban public research university. Much of our work cuts across institutional and department boundaries, and in today's context, especially the divide between East and West campuses. We are working hard to try to deepen and expand our understanding of inequalities as we look for research-based solutions to the most pressing challenges facing Chicago, Illinois, and I guess the nation and the world in some ways. The lecture series, this lecture is part of the Embodied Inequalities lecture series we started last year. It builds on all the important work going on campus already about racial disparities in health, and tries to explore in wider and perhaps deeper ways why exactly race is so consequential for health outcomes. And there are many probably in this room, UIC scholars who are already working on these issues, and we're trying to bring those folks together, bring other colleagues in who are doing important work in this area, and generate both intellectual community and new and interesting kinds of research and partnerships. This series is very much a joint effort between IRRPP and a growing number of on-campus and off-campus partners, including the Office of the Vice Chancellor for Community Engagement, the Office of Diversity, the School of Public Health, UIC's Cancer Center, the Health and Medicine Policy Research Group, the Institute for Health Research and Policy, the Center for Excellence in Maternal and Child Health. I apologize if I left anybody off, but partly this list is a sign of the both the important nature of these conversations, but also the really wealth in our community of people concerned and working on related questions. The next panel in the series is going to be on November 17th. The panel is called Trauma as a Community Public Health Crisis, Healing the Harms of Police Violence. And will be a conversation about sort of around the reparations ordinance that passed in Chicago a year ago with some of the survivors of police torture, some of the activists involved in getting the reparations ordinance passed, and a conversation about what it means to heal not just individuals, but entire communities that were impacted in many ways. There are also several other IRRPP events coming up, some of which have been appearing up here. There were flyers outside. The next one I just want to mention is one on October 26th next week, where we have 3 UIC scholars talking about the research on socialization, segregation, and the stigmatization of youth. And please go to our website, irrpp.uic.edu, to register or find out more. Before I introduce our speaker, 2 other notes. One is that we are videotaping today. This is being live streamed partly to give access to folks at Peoria and Rockford who want to participate in the conversation. And we are inviting folks online, as well as the people in the audience of this room, to tweet questions to us at IRRPP UIC and use the hashtag IRRPP Metzel. This is all kind of new to me, so did I say that right? Okay, good, thanks. Okay, now to the most important part. It's a great pleasure of mine today to be able to introduce to you Jonathan Metzel. He is the Frederick R. Rentschler II Professor of Sociology and Medicine, Health and Society, and the Director of the Center of Medicine, Health and Society, and Professor of Psychiatry at Vanderbilt University. This long title fits well with his status for as long as I've known him, where he typically has at least 3 different jobs at once. Dr. Metzel received his MD from the University of Missouri and his PhD in American Culture from the University of Michigan. A 2008 Guggenheim Fellow, Professor Metzel has authored 3 books, including Protest Psychosis, Prozac on the Couch, and Against Health, How Health Becomes the New Morality, several of which are available for purchase in the lobby, and Jonathan will be happy to sign copies afterwards. Professor Metzel has been an important public voice taking on myths about mental health and violence, and particularly taking on some important conversations about guns and gun violence. He's a prolific writer and truly interdisciplinary scholar. His writings have appeared in a wide range of academic and scholarly outlets, including medical, social science, feminist journals, and scores of public outlets. He is here today to talk about his work to challenge Not only those in medical health professions, we had a great conversation with a group of educators earlier today to think more broadly about how we should think about race and particularly racism in our work. And the title of the talk today is Structural Competency, a New Paradigm for Addressing Race and Racism in Medicine. Please join me in welcoming here to there.
Does the AV person know how I can, nothing against these amazing slides, but.
Which one's your talk? This one?
No, that one, yeah. Great, and I'm watching myself on TV here. Oh my God. I'm going to stand over here because I'm live on television here and it's kind of weird to watch yourself in live. But anyway, thank you so much. I'm really so honored and grateful to be here. So grateful for this invitation, this opportunity to contribute to the conversation that's been happening here about the intersections of education and health and race and racism. And I just think that this is really so exciting and truly at the cutting edge of all of the kind of conversations that are happening now about how can we, on one hand, train educators and health practitioners and students to, on one hand, be incredibly competent in their own, expertise and backgrounds, and at the same time, how can we also train people to engage with some of the pressing social justice issues of the present day. And so it's really an honor. It's also great to see many old friends and see how well things are going here at UIC, a place that I've interacted with a lot in the past. I'm going to talk today about a curriculum and what I feel is a kind of curricular success story that's been happening at Vanderbilt, and something that in a way we've been working on over the last couple of years. I came to Vanderbilt about 5 years ago. Before that, I was at the University of Michigan. Is everything okay with the AV?
You have to turn the mic up.
Oh, it is on.
Turn it up a little.
Up. I'm so sorry about that. Can everybody hear me? No. Up.
Oh, on this lapel?
Hello, does that work? Okay. Okay, what you missed was I gave a big thanks to everybody first. No, anyway, to summarize for people who didn't hear, it's great to be here. And I'm going to talk about our curriculum at Vanderbilt and what's been going on. Now, I was recruited to Vanderbilt about 5 years ago, and they said, come to Vanderbilt, you can kind of hang out, and like there's tons of palm trees, and you can just sit by the beach and just chill out. And there's some curriculum stuff and things like that, and you can design your own space. And I said, oh, that sounds awesome. I'll go be the chair of Medicine, Health, and Society. And it turned out, oh, and by the way, MHS is this huge unformed major that we're not quite sure what to do, and it's a kind of a medical humanities major, but we're not exactly sure kind of how to build it exactly. And can you also maybe in between your time like lying at the pool with the palm trees, which it turned out there actually weren't any in Tennessee, which I did not realize, can you also help us reshape this major? And so it's like, oh, I got down there, I'm like, where are the palm trees, darn it? And tell me about the major. So we started building this major, and we started building this new kind of major that was kind of an interdisciplinary major in critical health studies. And the framework we put around the major is called Medicine, Health, and Society, is that we study the social, societal dimensions of health and illness, and we really look at as I was mentioning before, the tension between kind of pedagogic expertise in methods, so the methods of medicine and public health and science and factors like that, with social, political, economic, historical contexts. And really the question was, is there a way that we can train pre-health students, but others, about half of our students go into the pre-med track, and the other half go into everything from nursing to public health to humanities, graduate school, etc. Is there a way that we can teach expertise and also teach social context together? Now, what we wanted to do was create, we can talk a bit maybe toward the end about how this engaged with medical humanities, but it was kind of like, could we bring in sociology and medical economics and anthropology and social sciences into a kind of medical humanities model to create this kind of pre-health major? And what we found, first of all, was that there was a tremendous, in fact, a really kind of remarkable amount of student response. So you can see that the major was kind of going along here, and all of a sudden there was this complete explosion in the number of majors. So whatever we were doing, the students responded in droves. This graph actually has another data point, which is that for the current year, we're now over 560 majors in our program. We're the second biggest undergrad major on Vanderbilt's campus in the college, and the fastest growing major. So there was a lot of demand. This demand led to a lot more courses. So all of a sudden we were like teaching more courses because the students were kind of asking for them. And so we've now surpassed 50 freestanding MHS courses. So this curriculum has gotten quite large. We've also seen an expansion in the kinds of students that come to MHS. So initially it was mostly pre-meds, and now we're seeing students that want to go into health prevention, health industry, healthcare, other kinds of things. Also a lot of grad students and other kinds of health providers. So for our students, really the choice of this MHS major involves a kind of, a kind of decision, which is that on one hand, they want this interdisciplinary experience. They want to be able to, learn about all these issues. And on the other hand, they want to be able to further their careers. I mean, that's partially why they're in college. And so they also want to be able to get into med school if they're pre-med, for example. And there's a decision, which I'll be talking about toward the end of the talk, in which they basically decide, should we be MHS majors and go the health route and do this interdisciplinary track? Or there's still probably the slight majority of students at Vanderbilt who go into a traditional pre-med track. And after I tell you a bunch of stuff about structural competency, I'm going to show you a bit of a comparison about the skill sets that MHS students and traditional pre-med students who are taking mostly sciences with some humanities classes on the side get. So anyway, I talked before that we had all this student demand. Students were coming to us, and we figured, how are we going to reorganize our curriculum? And what we did was our faculty got together and we shaped our curriculum in terms of really focus areas. And what we tried to do is not say there's a focus area in humanities, there's a focus area in social sciences, there's one in sciences. What we tried to do is think about theme areas, and really we did like focus groups with our students to ask, why would you be an MHS major? Why do you care? And we came up with these concentration areas up here that really, I think in many ways kind of spoke to the questions of why students were coming to MHS. And so things like global health, health behaviors, inequality, and then critical health studies was kind of make your own major. So first we created these pathways through our major. We had a big rollout party for the new curriculum. And I'm telling you all this in part because I'm going to give you some data toward the end of my talk that talks about what happened when we instituted these factors in our curriculum. We also started on the heels of that a new master's program, a master's in the social foundations of health. And basically what we did was just added an extra year onto the BA program for students who wanted to take an extra year of college in a way and get a master's degree. And when we started framing it in terms of this social foundations interdisciplinary issue, again, we saw a dramatic rise in the number of students. We now have 20 students in the cohort. So it's a big rise from 2, which is what it used to be. And you might be thinking, well, gosh, it must take a lot of people to do something like that. And part I will just admit up front is that, yes, we got more people to do this kind of growth. And so as student demand started coming, we did get tenure lines and senior lecturer lines and new administrators. And so when I came to MHS, I was the only tenure line person. And now we have, I think, 9 tenure track faculty in the center. We grant tenure in our center, and then lecturers, and we have agreements with other colleges. But hopefully what I'm going to tell you today is not that you need a private school and $1 zillion and endowment and all that kind of stuff to do something like this. Hopefully what you'll hear me say over this is, even though we did have the, I think, the good fortune of having those kind of resources available to us, that partially what happens when you integrate structural competency, does this mic work?
Yeah.
Okay, forget that mic. What happens when you integrate structural competency into a curriculum is that really what you're doing is changing the framework of your existing courses rather than needing a whole new center. So we hired all these faculty. The faculty are very interdisciplinary. So we have public health people, humanities scholars, writers, anthropologists, sociologists, many people who are, is that better? Many people who are all across the world, all across the field. The other issue is that we started having many events around campus, and so we started addressing. I'm so sorry, everybody. Is that better? No? Can you people in the back hear me? Barely? Oh, okay. Sorry, all the audience in the Soviet Union who's watching. What should I do?
Okay, can you try it and try
Is
it
that
in the other
better?
one? Try it in the other one.
Okay, good.
Try it in the.
Is that better? Okay. So for people who missed it, I was talking about our curriculum. No, I was kidding. Anyway, so basically my point here is that we're trying to create interdisciplinary community unlike UIC, Vanderbilt was a very traditionally disciplinary school. And so we were trying to create an interdisciplinary community around these questions of health and illness at Vanderbilt. So we built this new curriculum that was cutting across multiple disciplines. We hired interdisciplinary faculty. We had certain events around campus that kind of tried to bring people together who might not usually be in conversation with each other from across the campus. We had many engagements with the local health politics of the nation, kind of like what you guys are doing here, and politics of the South. And so we had a bunch of different conferences. Here's a big seminar we had on vaccine research that brought together people from all across the campus looking at it, vaccines politically and socially and in all the ways. We had a series of conventions and conferences and everything in between. So we had a conference on the politics of health. We just had a big conference on the politics of health in the South, looking at kind of health politics in our area, and so kind of engaging that way. We have a lot of media outreach and a lot of community interventions by our students who are going out into the community to do different kinds of events with the local community. And so the last part is that we're doing a lot of collaborative research with our students, where we have our students basically engage in questions in a kind of interdisciplinary way, working in teams, student theses and factors like that. And so that's kind of what we did to build community. And as I mentioned before, at least at the Vanderbilt level, it's been very successful. That we've had a lot of student demand. We've had students go on to multiple kinds of careers. And really, we're trying to foster this kind of community that bridges, even though we are based in the college, we're based in the College of Arts and Science, but what we're trying to do is bridge the medical and the arts and science campus. So we've got a lot of outreach, a lot of collaboration back and forth. And what we've done is picked, like you're doing here, picked areas of common interest and then say, like, let's have a conversation about these issues across different disciplinary boundaries. But at the same time, I think the question is, okay, so what are the skills that our students are getting? In other words, it's great because we're, in a way, inventing kind of a more sexy pre-med program that's not quite as straightforward as some of them. And of course, that's going to attract certain kinds of students, right? And so a lot of students are going to come to the center because they want to go to med school, they want to go to nursing school, social work, things like that. But what we're offering is also a chance to develop research methods. But beyond that, what are the skills that they're getting? What's the intellectual rationale that people are going to have for majoring in MHS? And in a way, why should undergrad students care about something like this? In other words, the themes I was just talking about, things like race and the clinical encounter, things like that, those are traditionally things that are addressed much more in a much more focused way in medical school. So why should undergrad students care about that, particularly vis-a-vis questions of race and society and factors like that? And so I'll just tell you pretty quickly why, just three reasons why I think students come to us intellectually. I'm going to just breeze over the first two very quickly, and then I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on the third one. The first one is that I think there's been a transformation in the ways American society and really pre-med education has been forced to think about health. So it used to be that we thought about health as a universal good, the absence of disease, of freedom from illness and pain. And in a way, we would bring in things like medical humanities traditionally in the, and earlier on to just say, okay, look, you're studying all this science and you're learning about illness, and now go read some Chaucer and you'll become more sensitive or something like that. So society would kind of come into this older model in a particular way. And I realize I'm oversimplifying for comedic effect. But in a way, there was this kind of engagement with illness in a particular way. And students, in a way, that was kind of in line with what pre-med education was doing. But it seems like that notion of illness is not in line with the questions of illness that are really present in the present moment. So all of a sudden, we've got people debating, do we want healthcare? Do we not want healthcare? Is health a universal good? Am I going to pay for different populations? And students live in that particular world. And so in a way, I think it challenged pre-health education and medical education to really address the complexity of health in the world that people are living in. And the Affordable Care Act debate was a perfect example of that. This is creepy Uncle Sam, who had a speculum. People might remember that advertisement. And so in a way, students are living in that world. And so in a way, there was, I think, a need for, I think he was covered by People's Healthcare Plan, but I think there was a need for addressing illness in a more nuanced way, and hopefully that's what we're trying to do. And similarly, there's been a transformation in how we think about disease. And so in an old model, disease, of course, and this is what you want. You go to a doctor, the doctor is going to identify an abnormal condition of your body. That's a very important approach to disease. But if you look at current scholarship, similar to complicating the idea of what health is, disease itself is also much more complicated. So you look at current literature in sociology, anthropology, disability studies, medical humanities. What we tried to do is bring that into our pre-health curriculum in a more integrated way. And the final reason, and what I'm going to talk about now for the next half hour, is that there also was a need for more complicated understanding of race, right? So in a way, there were prior models of the ways medical education was talking about race that weren't exactly in line with the way that students were kind of engaging, or people in society were engaging with questions of not just race, but racism. And so in the prior model, people might know this, there was a model that was, it still is very active in many ways. I mean, we're all still trained in it, but there was a kind of cultural competency framework that surrounded clinical education and health education and other factors like that. And what cultural competency did was, I think, in very important ways, how many people here are familiar with cultural competency? See, so many people still trained in this particular paradigm. It's important, right? In a way, doctors were not always trained to identify or talk about the racial or ethnic backgrounds of their patients. And if you look, for example, for people who do research in medical history, it's kind of trippy to look back at like medical charts or medical journals from the 1950s. They never talked about anybody's race in study populations and clinical populations, factors like that. And so in a way, cultural competency brought an awareness of difference into the framework, and it did try to change at least the interactions that doctors and patients were having about preconceived stereotypes that doctors or patients might have had. And so in a way, cultural competency was an important way of addressing factors like implicit bias and clinical interactions. And so here's a vignette from a cultural competency casebook, the one I just showed you. And in a cultural competency framework, it would present doctors with, you don't have to read all this text, but it was like, Mrs. Hernandez is a Cuban-American woman who comes to your office. She only speaks Spanish for the most part. She only wants to eat her Cuban food and things like that. What are you going to do as the doctor? And in this framework, it was like, okay, I want to learn something about Cuban culture. I want to get a translator into the room if I don't speak Spanish. All these things that I guess importantly would enhance the clinical communication. Of course, that's something that's very important. But what a cultural competency framework often left out is step back a little bit. You're going to engage with the doctor who's going to bring about this particular conversation. And then part of the vignette, if anybody read through it, is you're going to tell Mrs. Hernandez, take your medications with food, take healthy food. And the assumption was, understanding a bit about Cuban culture and things like that, we're going to increase our chance of following, the doctor's prescription in a kind of paternalistic way. But what people never asked was, how is Mrs. Hernandez going to get her food? Where does she live? Does she live in an area that has access to the kind of healthy food that the doctor was prescribing? Or does she live in a food desert and is surrounded by fast food restaurants like McDonald's and Taco Bell, and probably the worst name of a fast food chain in the history of fast food chains? That person either got fired or got a huge promotion. But anyway, sorry, that was a little joke. But so how is Mrs. Hernandez even getting the healthy food that you're going to prescribe for her? And when you're prescribing medications, how does Mrs. Hernandez pay for her medications? What are the frameworks? And so in a way, there was this awareness of the kind of structural framework that was not so much about the communication between the doctor and patient, and much more to do with the larger kind of context of neighborhoods and economics and health insurance, all these factors that were kind of, I think, in its most problematic formulations, being subsumed under the framework of culture when really they were much more about structure. And we see this again and again in frameworks beyond medicine, where we try to impose an interpersonal framework on an interaction, only then to learn that actually when you take structure into account, things get more complicated. And a perfect example of this that I use in my teaching is the response to Ferguson, Missouri, right? And so in the aftermath of Ferguson, Missouri, and of course this is very, very important, there were a lot of calls to make police more sensitive, to train police to be less biased, look at police in terms of their own biases and things like that. And that's super, super important until the Department of Justice report comes out. And all of a sudden you learn that the things that many people in Ferguson weren't happy about weren't about the interpersonal relationships with the police. I mean, they were, of course, that's life and death, but they also were having to do with racist zoning laws and segregated public housing and all these. I mean, if anybody here's read that report, it's all about like basically all these structural factors that made people feel helpless and isolated. And there was also systemic racism in the police force. And so the point is, even if we had the most implicitly unbiased police in the world in Ferguson, which turned out we didn't, it's still the case that there were all these structural factors that were surrounding their interactions. And that's certainly an important point for medicine now, because at the moment that cultural competency is still the main framework for talking about cultural difference, we have all of this science that's teaching us that actually society and structure itself is the pathogen, right? That in a way, you can be the most culturally competent dude in the world, and that's great. It really is great. I'm not trying to minimize that. It really is awesome. But if you're living in a world where there's epigenetics, and so there are all these structural factors that lead to, generational effects of ill health, the kind of ill health you're teaching, if you live in a place where, shockingly, neuroscience uncovers that if you live in a resource-poor environment, it's really bad for your brain development, and if you live in an area where neighborhood effects are using sociological and economic literature are in effect, that cultural competency has a harder time addressing those. And why is this important for medicine? It's also that doctors have a very hard time with these particular issues. And so there was, for example, a great survey done of most primary care and pediatric physicians by RWJ a couple of years ago. And they asked people, do you think unmet needs are leading directly to worse health outcome for Americans? And a whopping 85% of doctors, that's more doctors than will agree on pretty much anything. 85% of doctors said yes, we agree that unmet social needs are leading to worse health for the patients we're treating. And 85% of doctors also, I mean, this is sounding a little fishy, but it's true. 85% of doctors also said that they did not feel confident in their ability to treat social conditions. So in other words, doctors are feeling, I think, a lot of learned helplessness about this engagement with social issues. And part of the issue is that the methodologies that they are trained in which to address them fall short. Now, I really apologize. I've trained in history and in education and medicine, a bunch of other stuff. And so I'm going to take a little segue into history just very quickly, just to prove this point about why is it that I think that doctors are not particularly well trained about looking at these bigger structural issues. And the example I'm going to give is the race-based misdiagnosis of schizophrenia in African-American men. This is something that I studied in my book, The Protest Psychosis. And basically the argument of that book was that schizophrenia is very often assumed to be a very biological illness. And because it's assumed to be a biological illness, it should occur in about 1% of the world's population, regardless of who they are, where they live, what kind of music they listen to. So schizophrenia is an illness that among many of the psychiatric illnesses should have an equal distribution because it's happening at the level of this particular biological substrate. And yet, you can pretty much throw all that biological substrate information out the window when you add race and gender in a way to the mix, because African American men are 5, 6, even 7 times more likely to be overdiagnosed with schizophrenia and underdiagnosed with a bunch of other conditions, including depression and anxiety, ADD, other factors like that. So here's a place where if it's biology we're talking about, it should be an equal distribution. But when you add culture and race and gender to the mix, all of a sudden there's this big disparity. And the reason this is a problem is because, at least right now, there is no racial basis for schizophrenia. In other words, there's not any test that we can do that says that one race is more likely than any other race to get schizophrenia. And medicine has tried different frameworks to address this problem. They've tried training doctors in objective disease criteria, public information campaigns, but the most important one has been cultural competency, training doctors to pay attention to their implicit bias. And what happened when they did that? And unfortunately, the answer was pretty much not very much. Because if you look at the first studies of race-based misdiagnosis of schizophrenia that came out in the National Medical Association journal in the late 1960s, it showed about a 7 times higher chance of Black men being overdiagnosed with schizophrenia. And then if you look at the VA studies that were published about 2 years ago, it was about a 5 times higher rate. And so in a way, this persists, even though we've trained doctors in cultural competency. And why is that the case? And so in the book, I'll just tell you very briefly, what I did was I looked at a bunch of hospitalized charts from a large institution for the criminally insane called Ionia Hospital for the Criminally Insane in northern Michigan. This was a huge hospital, 450 acres, and it was home to mostly patients with schizophrenia. And what I found in looking through those charts is that there was a pretty radical transformation over the course of the 20th century in who got diagnosed with schizophrenia and why. And so initially, schizophrenia was this white woman's illness, and a lot of women who got diagnosed with schizophrenia in the hospital were coming in because they were feeling feeble or weak. They were sent for psychoanalysis and other treatments and all these kind of factors. And it really was a white women's illness. And lo and behold, what happened was over the course of the 20th century, but really in the 1960s and 1970s, all of a sudden, increasing numbers of African American men became the Black men with schizophrenia in this hospital. And what happened was, by the end of the period of my analysis, 1979, it was almost entirely Black men who filled this category of schizophrenia. And so the question was, for me, what happened? How was it that all of a sudden schizophrenia became this Black male disease? And certainly we could say there was more bias in the doctors. That was probably true, or they were not culturally competent, or factors like that. But in a way, I think this structural shift had much more to do with larger structural factors than it did with factors that were related to the interpersonal interactions of doctors and patients. And one good example of this was a shift in the ways that psychiatry as a framework defined schizophrenia. So in the 1950s, you can see from this chart that people, basically the DSM-1 came out and it talked about schizophrenia as an emotional disharmony with regressive behavior, and it was a mood splitting personality kind of thing. Now, regressive behavior, that doesn't sound very scary, right? I mean, somebody's regressed, they're probably at home regressing on their own, factors like that. And so who got diagnosed with schizophrenia when that was the framework? And in the 1950s, through the 1950s, representations of schizophrenia looked like this. Here's an ad for an antipsychotic from the early 1950s, from the American Journal of Psychiatry. And you can see that basically these women kind of sutured away their symptoms with the help of these antipsychotic drugs. Now, lo and behold, what happened in the 1960s, among many other factors that I'm not talking about here, is that there was a radical change in the ways that psychiatry defined schizophrenia. All of a sudden, the DSM-2 comes out in 1968, and the new definition of schizophrenia all of a sudden has all of this crazy new language: persecutory delusions, hostile and aggressive attitudes, projection. Now, projection is not regression. Projection is like, I'm going to blame you for my problems. I'm going to put them on you. I'm going to attack you for something I hate about myself. That's what projection means. But also language like this, hostile and aggressive attitude, enters the diagnostic framework all of a sudden for the very first time. And lo and behold, what happens? There's a radical change in the ways that psychiatry represents and thinks about schizophrenia. And in the aftermath of that, all of a sudden you see representations like this happen, where all of a sudden the person with schizophrenia looks like the godfather of soul. And he's angry and he's in the street and he's not regressing, sitting there doing needlepoint. Instead, he's going to project you in the face with his shaking, angry fists. And all of a sudden, the language changes. And of course, this is also to do with, medications and insurance and other factors like that. But picking up this language, assaultive, belligerent, angry, hostile. And so in the project that I did after the book came out, I just started tracking that language. And it turned out, lo and behold, after that 1968 language came out, all of a sudden those terms like aggressive, violent, hostile, they were overwhelmingly used to describe Black patients, and particularly Black male patients, and less so other patients. And you can see in these charts, for example, that all of a sudden Black men became overwhelmingly described as violent toward others. They all of a sudden were mentioned as criminal in much more expansive ways. And so in a way, what I'm trying to show you is that in this very quick example, it wasn't just that there was more physician bias. There was also a change in the structural framework. It was in part a structural framework of how we defined illness, but that went hand in hand with also just who got admitted to a psychiatric hospital in the first place. So all of a sudden there was this bigger frame about when people were calm and doing needlepoint, they weren't even in the hospital anymore. So there were all these structural changes about diagnosis and economics and who was getting surveilled and all these other factors that led to this thing that then later on became coded as being racial bias racial bias was important interpersonally, but there was much bigger structural level shift happening. And that's where this idea of structural competency came from. So the idea kind of came to me while I was writing that book and said, wait a minute, if we use the tools of medicine like cultural competency to address this question, which is how most people through like the early 20th century were dealing with race-based misdiagnosis of schizophrenia. And if we use that paradigm, in a way, we're missing out on this bigger structural story. So with my colleague Helena Hansen at NYU, we started looking more carefully at questions of what is it about the structure? And in a way, it almost sounds so helpless, right? Like, what's a doctor going to do about structure exactly? And so we started taking that question very seriously because culture, it gives you something to do with. You can, have somebody walk in your room and you can say like, oh, hey, let's talk about your culture. But when it's like, hey, come on in. No, that's not an illness. That's, that's a larger structural foundation. So instead of treating you, I'm going to go pick it outside the healthcare insurance or something. No. The question for us was, if structural pathologies are at play here, what does that mean for the politics of medicine and everyday practice? So we started writing about this. So Helen and I did a lot of writing. I'm also doing a series of pieces with Dorothy Roberts at Penn, where we're looking at the relationships between structural competency and structural racism. So we really started thinking pretty seriously about this. We also have a structural competency, like almost a real fake organization now. So people want to go on structuralcompetency.org. We're doing a lot of interventions and workshops and really kind of coming up with these particular questions. Now, you might be thinking, well, what is structural competency? And that would be a good question because I have a slide that says what structural competency is. And so structural competency, as we define it, is the trained ability to discern how a host of issues defined clinically or biologically as symptoms, attitudes, or diseases, which they are. I'm not trying to say that you want a doctor who's just going to say what you're suffering from is some downstream thing. It's like, no, dude, I'm having appendicitis, fix it. So there are real symptoms, but they are also shaped by a number of upstream decisions about matters such as healthcare, food delivery systems, zoning laws, infrastructures, medicalization, and the frameworks of illness and health. So in a way, it's trying to think about these larger factors in the context of clinical interactions. Now, when we talked about this in social science and medicine, we talked about structural competency as having 5 core skill sets. So it's kind of like recognizing that there is maybe a structural reason for some clinical problems, re-articulating what we might think of as culture, also in relation to structure, so kind of reframing some of those questions, developing cultural formulations and structural terms, so to say, this patient is having hypertension, and here are some of the larger issues that might be at play here, imagining what to do about it, And I think a really important one that got left out of a lot of the writing that was about it is also humility. So in other words, what we also wanted to do was say doctors are not the only voice of expertise when we're talking about structure. And so if you're going to talk about this, it's also important to take into account many other professions, everything from urban planning, architecture, nursing, social work, that medicine is one voice in this if we're going to look at structurally. So in a way, part of the issue was to say that medicine, a biomedical frame, doesn't have all the answers, which I think was part of the problem that cultural competency got into. I'll just say quickly, I'm a devotee of Stokely Carmichael, and so our definition of structure was very much informed by his definition of institutional racism. Competency, I don't think anybody in their life, and certainly not me, is ever going to become competent in structure. But I do think that in a way, what we're trying to say is this should be a skill set that we can train doctors in. And so let me just spend the last 10 or 12 minutes here before I finish up talking about how we've integrated structural competency into our curriculum and what I think the implications are for teaching pre-med students. So I mentioned before that here was this thing called structure. We had this formulation. And the other issue about structural competency was that it was very often presented for clinicians. And so for people who are following, if anybody's on our listserv, there are a lot of structural competency interventions that are, Westchester Medical School now has a one-day seminar for physicians on structural competency. It's working its way into medical schools. But I teach a center where we have all these pre-meds. And so we started thinking this is really an important skill for pre-meds to learn also, because college is a time where you can actually take the time to develop multiple kinds of expertise, even if you're focusing in one particular area. So we started thinking about how to intervene structurally in our curriculum. Now, the students almost led the way here. We had a seminar on structure, and we were talking about food deserts. And there's this famous case of a doctor who told their patient to take their medication with healthy food, and then the patients were like coming back and just eating McDonald's, and the doctor's like, "You're non-compliant with my orders." And they were like, "No, we have to go 2 hours to get fresh produce," and all these kind of things. It was like the classic food desert. So our students kind of invented this idea of the Nashville mobile market, and they started partnering with local food organizations and local partners, and they actually rented 16 refrigerated food trucks, and they go out into lower income areas in Nashville now, and they have this whole kind of engagement with delivering healthy produce, and now it's going to become, they just got a big grant for it. It's going to be in a couple of other cities as well. And so our students kind of led the way and said, we can work outside the classroom on this. I mentioned before that we have this new curriculum, and I apologize for all the words on the slide, but don't worry about the slide. Just listen to me, and I'll tell you that what we did is we had a big workshop with all of our faculty and many students, and we started saying, okay, let's take structure as a framework for our curriculum, as a unifying skill set that we might, people didn't have to do it, but let's take structure as a unifying skill set, and how can we kind of bring together people to think about this? And so our faculty started saying, okay, here's what we can do. We can add structural awareness into some of our concentration areas. We had new courses being taught, and people all of a sudden started teaching classes on the lived environment and the community, and what kinds of, what is urban planning doing about health. Very nicely, a lot of the existing courses, like medical humanities courses, we started thinking, how can we have structural immersion as part of medical humanities courses? And so we started doing things like taking students into the environment and doing all these kind of community engagement projects. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but really it became a unifying principle for a lot of our curricular interventions. And basically our thought was that if we try to bring together all of these multiple forms of expertise, that in a way it becomes a kind of literacy for our students, which I think was an important skill set for us. And we really wanted to, as in line with what I was saying before about the 5-part model, we really wanted to address how structures influence health, where students engaged with socioeconomics, with the environment, with infrastructure. And we also wanted students to understand that health was biological and social. So those were kind of our key points in our curricular formation. And then we basically experimented. So what we did next was we had a kind of pilot curricular evaluation project where we developed an evaluation tool, and we compared results of 107 graduating seniors from MHS 80 seniors who graduated. Remember before I told you that a lot of students at Vanderbilt are still traditional science students, right? And so we also assessed the graduating pre-health senior science students. And recently, this data just came in like 2 nights ago, so I just added it into some of these slides last night. We also, as a kind of comparison group, added in freshmen just to get a sense of what skills students were starting the Vanderbilt curriculum with. And then we started asking them different kinds of questions. We developed a survey called the Social Foundations of Health Survey, which again, I'm happy to share with anybody who's interested in it. But basically, first we asked them about how important do you think your skill set is? What did you learn in college, basically? Did you learn about communication? Did you learn about socioeconomics? How confident do you feel in knowledge about the healthcare system? Factors like that. And what we saw, at least for the self-reported questions, was that MHS students who are these, is that taupe? Teal, oh yeah, sorry. MHS students in teal. And what we saw was that particularly in questions of relationship to socioeconomic status and health, knowledge of the healthcare system, knowledge of the Affordable Care Act, and some about basically talking to diverse patient populations, that our students all reported that they felt more confident than the other students. It's kind of funny because here's when you add in the freshmen. And so these are the MHS students, and you can see that they're overwhelmingly saying that they're more confident in issues like the Affordable Care Act and socioeconomics and stuff like that. But the freshmen are often like, I know everything. So they are, in a way, the freshmen who just were coming in, we tested them in their first week of college. They were like way more confident about these matters than graduating seniors. So we thought that was kind of funny. The next part of the evaluation is that we asked people, what are the most important influences on people's health? And we just asked them to give us, 3 words and just kind of tell us. Now, I'm going to show you the responses. First, here are the MHS students' responses using the word cloud, which I love. And so you look at the MHS responses. Again, the question was just, what are the most important influences on people's health? And you can see here that MHS students use the language that we love. So stuff about socioeconomics, education, environment. When we asked the pre-meds, the graduating pre-meds, what are the most important factors on people's health? This was their word cloud. And basically every single person put genetics first. It was pretty much across the board. So there was a real difference in how, and genetics was on the MHS students, but the pre-med seniors were much more likely to talk about that and much less likely to talk about things like, you can see socioeconomics and access factors like that were down the road. Another thing we did in the evaluation instrument, I'm being kind of sneaky here, is that we gave them that cultural competency formulation from the cultural competency course book. And we just said, can you analyze this for us? And we were wondering, were people going to use culture, structure, factors like that? In other words, remember I told you before that one of the skills of cultural competency was re-articulating culture in structural terms. And we saw a real difference in the ways that different students talked about it. Here's an MHS student talked about Mrs. Hernandez, the woman. She lives in a food desert. She has communication problems, factors like that. The pre-med science major said, since Mrs. Hernandez is a foreigner, she might not trust her listen to the doctor, language barrier. So no mention of things beyond the clinical encounter. Another thing for the evaluation instrument is that we gave a map of childhood obesity in the US South. And we asked students to kind of give us our sense of why is there higher obesity in the South. So we gave them this map. And then we asked them a bunch of prompts, is it cultural, is it genetic, is it structural, is it linked to insurance? And then we also asked them to kind of write out some sentences for us. So kind of a similar kind of thing. Here you can see that the MHS students were far more likely than the graduating pre-med seniors to talk about structural and cultural formulations. So kind of interesting there. And there were linguistic differences in terms of how the students wrote about it. So pre-med science majors would often use either language of genetics, but we would very often see these formulations that talked about how individuals dictate their own lifestyle choices, which is something that came up again and again. MHS majors talked about income, they talked about education, opportunities available, factors like that. So far more structural factors. Here's another long quote, but just the point is that people were talking about income and the correlations of income and environment. So again, different language being used. Two other parts of the evaluation instrument, we talked about African-American men have 30% more heart disease, and we again asked them to do cultural versus structural formulations. Again, it was interesting here, the MHS students were much more likely to talk about structural factors, the pre-meds were much more likely to talk about cultural factors, and basically things like lifestyle differences for, or genetics for the standard pre-meds, whereas the MHS majors were talking about neighborhood factors and institutional racism. So a real language difference in how students were talking about this. Just a few other points before I go on to the conclusion here. I really think it's important to note that MHS students were across the board much more likely to select structural factors. And when we just compiled all the things, it really was true that when the students were talking about structure, it really was linked to MHS in the two other opportunities, the obesity and cardiovascular. We finally gave students a pharmaceutical ad because we wanted to emphasize the point that structure is not just about health disparities for low-income people. You know, there are structures of health that surround all of us, and there are structures of whiteness and privilege that are just as important for understanding structure. And I'll just say, to summarize, because I want to move to my conclusion, that we had a much harder time with the responses to the message of privilege. You can see here that really less than 50% of students identified privilege or whiteness or talked about race. And the other interesting part was, in their response to this, nobody talked about genetics. We didn't have one single response where anybody was talking about genetics. And so in a way, there is this association of health disparities means we're talking about people of color. And we've been trying to get around that, but we're having a really hard time. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit in the Q&A. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that overall, our students were much more likely than pre-med students to address structural factors and health outcomes, and they were also much more likely to address distal structural factors, so bigger factors like economies and networks and neighborhoods. And they were also much more comfortable with this language of structure, which was, again, the point, which was, can they talk about the language of sociology and economics and other factors? So really, I think we saw an emergence of a skill set. Now, I love this graph. I'm sorry, it's kind of hard to take in really quickly, but basically this was, here were the students who had, who never mentioned structure in any answer on our evaluation. And these are the students who took 0 MHS classes. So in other words, like almost 80% of students who didn't mention structure in any response had not taken 1 MHS class. And what we found was that the more MHS classes that students had taken, the more likely they were to identify structure in their answers, at least on our evaluation instrument, to the point here where you can see that about half of the students, and this is combining the freshmen and the med students and everybody like that. So really, the point here is that the more MHS courses that people took, the more comfortable they were with using this particular language of structural racism, institutional racism in their replies. So you might be wondering, why is this all important? And I'll just end with this. Of course, it's important because, you know, we're giving the students in our coursework this language, and then they're reproducing that coursework for us in this exam. And so in a way, it's like, yeah, of course, this is what we taught them. But I think in part that's the point, right? We're trying to teach them a skill set. And so you could say, somebody could say, well, that's just the language you taught them in our courses. And we're like, yeah, that's just the language we taught them in our courses. And so that's part of it. But also, medicine cares increasingly about that kind of language. And so increasingly in, for example, the MCAT and the AAMC, there's kind of this interdisciplinary integrated approach to matters of not just diversity, but other areas. So the new MCAT, for example, has a lot of stuff on there about social science and engagement in communities and things like that. So partially medical testing is going that way. Another point is that I know a lot of parents had wondered, well, if my kid wants to be a doctor and they're going to be an MHS major, I'm worried they're not going to get into medical school. And we found in tracking the health advisory data that tracks people, it actually doesn't hurt people if they want to get into medical school. And in many instances, it gives students who are maybe a bit more, social science and not hard medicine, hard science approached, in a way, a kind of pathway. And so what we're finding is that the rates of getting into medical school are pretty much the same between all the three majors. And so it's not like we're hampering people if their goal is to go on and be doctors. And more broadly, in a way, we're just trying to create this kind of model of synergy in which we're trying to kind of help students both master the sciences, but also kind of engage with the worlds that they live in. And in a way, the broader point, we talked about this a little bit at lunch, was that the broader points, I think there are two kind of final broader points about why I think structural competency is important. And one is that when you hear about doctors advocating at the bigger political realm about like what medical interventions are, for example, the ACA debate was, I think, a perfect example where the voices of medicine were about, and understandably, I mean, I think everybody should earn a living, right? But there were kind of either people saying, it's all about like reimbursements and things like that, which are important, but it was never like, here's the social mission of medicine. It's to be out in neighborhoods. It's to create these communities. So in part, what we're trying to do is provide the doctors of tomorrow and the clinicians of tomorrow with a kind of language that can change medical politics. And also, as we were kind of going through this, it wasn't kind of lost in us that the doctors who were in the public sphere were arguing for kind of the exact opposite of structural competency, except of course for creepy Uncle Sam. And so in a way, in the end of the day, what we're trying to do is kind of raise to this larger challenge, which is again, and I'll just say this in finishing, that there was a kind of temporal challenge, which is on one hand, we want doctors who are good, or nurses, social workers, administrators. We want people to know their skills, but when you integrate that with the kind of knowledge I was talking about, it also helps them in this larger project, which is addressing matters of health justice and health inequity. Thank you very much. Please.
Is there any interaction between your center through the rest of the health center, Vanderbilt Medical School?
So the question is, are we working with medical students also?
And residents and
Right.
physicians? I mean, what's your scope, and do you do any interprofessional education?
So I'm sorry, I should have said that in the beginning. We are working, we do have outreach to Vanderbilt Medical School, and there is a lot of structural competency in medical school that's happening in many other places. And so there are residency modules. We did a huge thing with a webinar series for medical students across the country. So there is, I think, there is a large medical center that might make this a competency for residents. So I think there is a lot of engagement with medical students, and certainly with residents. I've done a lot of work in resident education. I guess when I do this kind of work, I start to think, what are the strengths and limitations of doing this in multiple populations? We had a great talk at lunch about structural competency in education settings beyond the healthcare system. And I think it's been interesting to work with undergrads. One thing that drives me like a little bonkers is, for example, when I went to medical school, first we had this crazy thing where somebody would come in, we'd learn all the science stuff, and then somebody would come in and give us a 2-hour talk on race, and they would actually do pre and post testing to see if that lecture changed how racist we were or something like that. And it was just like kind of like, that's really not the way to make somebody understand this factor. And so it's got to be much more integrated. So partially what we argue on one hand is that this has to be integrated across disciplines, but also that maybe pre-med is a way to help students address the competencies. So the AAMC competencies, for example, are all about medical students, but I feel like it would give students a leg up. And also the other thing is in the undergrad years, it's also a time where you have a semester-long flexibility to kind of develop more nuanced understanding. So in a way, I guess the long answer to that is I see this as a continuum, ideally, in which addressing this in pre-med and in med school and in residency will, I think, be more fluid than what's happened to this point, which is that it started in med school as kind of a lunchtime add-on kind of thing, but there was no context for it. So, I mean, that would be beside taking over the world, that would be my goal. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. So some might argue that increasing racial ethnic diversity in the medical workforce is actually the key to alleviating structural incompetency. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. I'm going to call back to my schizophrenia research. It was pretty interesting. Like when I was studying the race-based misdiagnosis of schizophrenia, Black men were, I mean, 7 times. It's just nuts, right? But then Woody Neighbors, this great public health scholar at Michigan, said, well, let's look at the race of the doctors. And it turned out that Black doctors and white doctors were equally as likely to overdiagnose schizophrenia in Black men. And for him, it was like, how is that possible? Like, these should be down, right? And I was like, no, because it's not about their identity. It's about the tool they're using. It's about the framework. It's about the healthcare system. It's all these things. And so in a way, I guess the point is, I'm not trying to argue against diversity. I think diversity is super, super important. And we do kind of see it in medical education. So now, like, for example, most medical students it's mostly women. There's much more diversity. It's not obviously there yet, but diversity is something we have to keep pushing on. But I also think that we still have to keep pushing on the frameworks, because I think that's kind of part of what I was trying to suggest.
Hi, I am a grad student at Applied Health Science Nutrition.
Cool.
And everything that you spoke about today is something that I argue with and deal with on a regular basis.
Who are you arguing with?
Well, within my instructors and just the structure of the program, I feel like they lack that cultural sensitivity. There's nothing embedded in our program. So I constantly am throwing and challenging out why, because you mentioned how these doctors and med students are trained. Well, they're training the same thing, training nutrition students in the same manner. It's just that parroting back that Blacks and Hispanics and minorities, they have these health conditions and they have this, and they suffer from that, but we never address those issues as to why they have these issues, what outside factors affect their health, because it's much more than, as I call it, the Twinkie effect. It's not just Twinkie.
The what effect, sorry?
Twinkie effect.
Okay.
And hot Cheetos and things of that nature. And I feel like nutrition itself suffers from having that lack of. And I was just wondering, have any other colleges reached out to you and would like to have something like this?
Oh, I would love that. No, that would be great, because it's such a key part of what we're doing. I mean, to be clear, I actually love hot Cheetos, but no, I think that kind of interdisciplinary would be terrific. And I also think what you're speaking to is slightly a generational difference in terms of how people are trained, which I think is true for a lot of different approaches as well. But no, I think that in a way, that's why I think this language of competency is so great, because you can take it literally, which, that's cool. Many people do. But like, if you look at the code book for, like, if anybody here is like bored tonight and they don't want to watch baseball or the debate, just go read the AAMC Handbook on competencies in medical education. And there are so many competencies that, for example, pre-med students need to learn. And on one hand, that's great, right? Like, you don't want to go to a doctor and you're like, I need surgery. And the doctor's like, what is surgery? It's a feeling, it's a state. Like, you want them to be competent and say, like, yeah, we're gonna do this. But on the other hand, like, if you look at the competencies, there's also religious competency, gender competency. Like, people who study religion, spirituality competency, like, they would say you're never competent in spirituality. Like, it's always a process of humility. That's the whole deal. And so in a way, addressing this as competency means it really is a kind of humility building exercise to say the biomedical frame doesn't do everything. You don't have to solve every single problem when you're a doctor. In a way, what you have to do is know who to reach out to, what kind of networks you want to build, what kind of alliance can we build. And I feel like medicine has not been that great about that, for financial and other kinds of reasons. But in a way, if you want to be structurally competent, you need to reach out to people who know about nutrition, about food networks, factors like that. So in a way, it's kind of an open innovation. Now, you might think I'm on peyote, which maybe I am. But I would also say we've had opening moments where this kind of integrated approach has been possible. And one was the debate or non-debate or whatever it was that we had about the Affordable Care Act, where there was an opening to kind of reformulate things. And I think what happened, unfortunately, was that there was no crossover language and people ended up falling back into very disciplinary approaches. But hopefully we can kind of appreciate this more as things move forward.
Hello. Right here.
Okay. I thought you were like, no.
the voice of reason. I'm a graduate student of community psychology. This is really weird. I'm hearing myself echo. But I'm a graduate student in the community psychology program. And recently I graded an assignment where students responded about their biases and their values and kind of evaluated their class and thought about their culture and structural issues. And so what surprised me was that white students had a very nuanced perspectives on privilege, class, and culture and how that affected their lives. And so that got me, I was surprised to see that that wasn't happening in the program. So I was thinking about the differences between Chicago and Nashville and UAC and Vanderbilt.
Absolutely.
And how you incorporate that into the curriculum.
Right. I mean, it's funny because, you know, as we're doing all this testing, right, we're also having Ferguson and Dallas and everything else going on in the world. I mean, issues of equity and justice are kind of in the air, or have been, and hopefully will continue to be, not for horrible reasons like shootings, but just because people, you know, care about this thing. And so I think that there is a need to move forward across the board for factors like that. In other words, I think that this question of privilege 5 years ago, even, I think we would have had much lower responses than actually we did. Now, it is about the drug ad thing. We'll talk about it in a sec, but I do think that people are at least starting. I think there's a lot more. I mean, we just had a presidential debate where one of the candidates talked about implicit bias and structural reform and stuff like that. And I think that that's a result of this kind of ground up kind of pressure that's happening. And so I do think there's a push, and there's a model for that, right? In medicine, for example, the medical framework changed in the 1960s and 1970s because people all of a sudden cared about community engagement. And there was this whole thing called the community health movement. And I mean, there are models out there for times where the politics of the moment change our practices about health and illness. Now, in answer to your question, I'm super aware that Vanderbilt has different populations, different resources, different other kinds of factors. And so in a way, it is in a way a particular challenge at Vanderbilt. Now there's been a huge diversity push at Vanderbilt over the last couple of years. And so that's partially it, but it's also like a private Southern kind of school, not an urban school. And so in a way, I think that that's a challenge. I mean, at lunch today, we were talking about collaborating between UIC and Vanderbilt. And I would love that because the structural factors are different. The sensibilities are different. But I would also say that I hope you can hear me say that part of the success that we had at Vanderbilt wasn't just that somebody threw a ton of money our way. It was really that we brought people together across disciplines and said, here's the framework we want to use. Now, how can we work this into different kind of classes? And that became a very generative exercise. And so I think that really that's a challenge, is kind of, if this is an issue that's of importance, we really need to start having those kind of conversations. Please.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask about the structural violence that's actually within medicine itself.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like some of the examples that you kind of get people to talk about are kind of like out there, like the environment or housing or et cetera. But there's a lot of structural violence that's obviously built into the medical system. And so do you also, whether that comes from your own work about misdiagnosis or about criminalization that occurs in Dorothy Roberts' work, or just the imposition of particular ways of thinking about the body or approaching the body. So do you also talk to the students about the kinds of violences that medicine itself is kind of transpiring, and then how do they respond to that?
Well,
what are their options?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, absolutely, that's a part of our curriculum. It's not so much a part of our evaluation, but maybe we should add it in there. I mean, what was the question we were talking about at lunch about hopefulness and hope, and what's the role of the medical? What should the role of biomedicine be? I mean, maybe there are ways that we could kind of get at that using the positive psychology spin as opposed to, but I would say, of course, like that's where I'm coming from, right? I mean, I study guns and misdiagnosis and like really upbeat stuff. And so I think part of the issue is the kind of challenge of on one hand, for the evaluation instrument, we were trying to think about like median things that people could kind of project onto, and maybe that came out and maybe it didn't. And maybe there's a way to address that, but certainly in the courses we teach, that's a huge, I mean, it's like me and Ken McLeish, who works on the military, and Amy Hamrai, who's a, disability and local environment thing. So it's a huge part of what we teach. But I guess the question, which I'd love to hear maybe anybody's thoughts or your thoughts about is that something that, even with the drug ad, for example, you could say, this is something that's being done to people in a certain kind of way, medicalizing motherhood and other kinds of factors. But we tried to be as, unlike many of my slides, as we tried to be as unverbose as possible in a kind of way, and just say that we wanted that to come from people as opposed to us prompting them for it in a way, just to see if that was something they were going to come up with on their own. And again, it did come up a lot in the other questions about cardiac disease and other things like that, like, racism, oppression. There's a lot of stuff about physician bias, tons of stuff about physician bias, but hardly any of it on the drug ad thing. So I think that's really the challenge. And is it an evaluation challenge? Is it a pedagogic challenge? Is it a challenge that just whiteness is invisible and we need better methods for it, which I think is probably the case. So it's kind of all of those factors. But that was a pretty interesting disparity in our results. Please.
We talked about a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the current push towards precision medicine? About, because part of this is about structural competency, but I also see it as partly trying to bring more complicated conversations about race and how it matters into conversations about medicine and health and illness.
And it's always a challenge. I mean, as like somebody who's a physician myself, like there's so much pressure. Like you have 7 minutes to save somebody's life or you're going to get sued and get the reimbursement. Like people are under a lot of pressure. I realize that. And so in a way, what I don't want is for any of this stuff to be, oh man, here's just another thing we have to do to check a box or something like that. But I also think there's a danger. Precision medicine is the latest potentially great thing that also could potentially just reify some stereotypes and I say that because even though I used cultural competency here is slightly a straw person as a kind of foil, but I do think that when somebody came up with the idea of cultural competency, they were like, nobody's talking about this stuff in the clinical, and it's really important to talk about this stuff. And like somebody had a really brave idea, and that brave idea impacted pretty much every doctor-patient interaction. But what happened then was, first it was this brave idea, gosh, we need to bring awareness of race and ethnicity into the exam room. And it became like, I don't know, when I went to med school, they gave us flashcards for the different ethnicities. And so like, they would be like, here's the different cards depending on whose room you're going into. And like the one for Asian Americans, I'll never forget this, was you were supposed to go in and compliment their ancestors. And so like you would go into the room and like there were people and the guy's like, dude, I'm from Fresno, like whatever. But they're like, yeah, you're, and it just got to the point where like you'd think like it was going to be like, you'd go into a room of an African American patient, it would be like, yo, homie, what's up, or something like that. It got to be this level of kind of stereotyping in a way, which I think was dangerous. And so in a way, what the idea was to what happened. And I think with precision medicine, it's a similar kind of point that in a way, here's something that's engaged with trying to address disparities, but it's very, very, very individual. It's telling people it's just about your DNA and your doctor and your blood samples. And I want to make a Ted Williams joke, but I won't if anybody wants to talk about. But the thing is like it reinforces this whole idea. And I think the great part about it is we're going to know a lot more about how drugs are metabolized, and it has population level effects. But the danger, beside the fact that the database is very racially imbalanced, it so far is really only, it's really a very privileged database so far. But the danger is that we start looking so much at the individual that we forget all this stuff that we're talking about. I think that's something that continually has to be happening. And part of my kind of pet peeve about this is that medicine is great traditionally at those kind of diagnoses. I mean, one example we were talking about at lunch, there was this huge multi-site study, I think it was like 10 or $15 million, about the neurobiology of poverty. And they did all these sites, they did all these people, maybe it was Chicago also, it was certainly Michigan, all these brain scans, all these MRI scans. And it turns out after like 15 years and millions of dollars, they found out that poverty is really bad for brain development. That was kind of the take-home point, that if you grow up like with a lot of stress and few resources and poor nutrition, it's kind of bad for your health. And then they closed up shop and they went on to the next thing. And nobody said like, well, let's take $15 million and like try to fix poverty, you know, something like that. And so in a way, precision medicine can go any number of ways. And I think I gave a talk at a precision medicine seminar at Columbia. They're like Vanderbilt kind of very invested in it. And I said like, it's an opportunity to have a conversation about the tensions between the individual and the structural, but we really need to keep that conversation going, I think. Please.
Thanks for your presentation. It sounds like the model suggests a need for clinicians to also engage politically and in activism. Could you talk about the degree to which it does that?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I don't want to, I mean, again, I have so much empathy for the individual interaction. And I do have a lot of respect for people who say, I care about these issues a lot, but what am I going to do? Like I have 10 minutes and then the next patient's coming and stuff like that. And so partially this model is at its heart trying to create a grassroots movement that will change the political language of medicine. So I think part of this is that in debates where equity is on the table, the AMA and the American Psychiatric Association and other places are silent, right? When they could be standing up for community engagement and justice. And there are sites where that's happening. I just gave a talk at Johns Hopkins, very troubled history there, but they're like rebuilding neighborhoods and doing other, I mean, there are engagements of healthcare systems, which I know have financial problems, but I actually think it's better for everybody and better for the bottom line to have those kind of interactive conversations. So partially, I think the goal is to create pressure on the institution, which I think is what happened in the 60s and 70s, for example, with community health. And then, and that's partially why we want to kind of start people in med school and undergrad and work its way up. And then I think in a way, the more difficult question is, okay, how is this going to change people's everyday practices, right? And so we're working on that a lot. We're working with an anthropologist in LA who's developing a structural vulnerability checklist, for example, Philippe Bourgeois, where people come into the emergency room and we have all of these structural factors. And in a way, it's kind of like, okay, let's assess. How do you get your medications? How did you get to the hospital? What's the transit system? Stuff like that. So partially, we're trying to create a database of course, the danger is that it becomes so rote and operationalized that it's another checkbox. But we are trying to develop tools like that. We're also doing kind of seminars and webinars and things like that. But I think in a way, I don't know, like I said, for better or worse, somebody had this idea that cultural competency was something we should do. And 15 or however many years later, it at least played some role in every doctor-patient interaction. And so in a way, it's not like paradigms don't have those implications, on the ground implications. So.
Any last question? Yeah,
so you talked about the flashcards and your teaching of cultural competency in your own training, and I'm wondering how you bake into your pedagogy the avoidance, and it's probably easier at the undergrad level, but the avoidance of structures being analyzed in a reductionist manner.
And can you say what you mean? I mean, I think I know what you mean, but in what way?
Well, you know, you could have a lecture about sexism, right? It being X, Y, or Z, or racism as being X, Y, or Z. Mm-hmm. But yet, as we know in feminist studies, et cetera, right? It's a really complicated topic, and it has different iterations in different locations and So I'm wondering how you avoid reductionism in the pedagogy of structural competency.
Right. I love that structural reductionism. I hadn't thought about that. But no, I think that that's always the caveat. I mean, that's the caveat for undergrads is a much bigger caveat for one lunchtime seminar a year on structural competency or things like that. And so in a way, I mean, I don't have an answer in a way. I mean, I'm putting this out there as part of the problem of changing a framework and changing a paradigm. I do think that question of, I mean, really, let's think about cultural competency, for example, because in a way, culture became, I mean, that's kind of the critique of cultural competency, right? Is that culture became reduced. And is that all a bad thing? I mean, I'm just putting it out there that in a way it did, as I was saying before, also change every doctor-patient interaction and other factors. It changed people's framework sensibilities. I mean, I don't think it was particularly effective because we still have all these health disparities in, you know, diagnosis and treatment and things like that. But I really think that's kind of the million-dollar question. And I think that that's a bigger question. And it's not just a question of how do individual doctors act or students. It's really like, how do we conceptualize what the role of the healthcare system is in our society? And I know that's like, right? But I do think that, I mean, we have models for that kind of integration. And I think other countries have models for that kind of integration. And so, you know, I mean, this is like a long non-answer to your question because that's the danger. Like, say structural competency replaces cultural competency, then it just becomes another thing that you got to check off. So in a way, it's kind of like there's always going to be an ongoing debate. I mean, two ongoing debates here. One is about the simple versus the complex. The other is the on the ground versus the meta, right? And I just think I embrace those as tensions because we're having the conversation. But I think that's the challenge.
Hi, one more question. There's this interesting book that came out last year. It's called Black Men in a White Coat, A Doctor's Reflection on Race and Medicine by Damon Tweedy. Read that book, and would you integrate that in your education?
Oh, sure. You know, and in fact, thank you for telling me that. Also, like, there's tons of cool stuff happening from medicine. So we work a lot with, like, for example, White Coats for Black Lives. I mean, there's all this cool grassroots activism that's happening. And so I do think that there's a kind of groundswelling of stuff out there, of very socially conscious clinicians. And I think there's a need for this. So partially what we're doing is just trying to add to a conversation. It's not like, oh my gosh, we invented this whole thing. But I do think that even talking to the White Coats for Black Lives people who, I don't know if people here are engaged with them at all, but it's this really cool thing. They were having like die-ins and other things, but then they would have to go back to class and learn about cultural competency and stuff like that. And so in a way, I think there's a vacuum for a particular skill set that calls on all these other conversations that are happening.
Please join me in thanking Jonathan.
Thank you guys.
And we will be around for a few minutes as the medical bookstore is selling a few books and they want to get one signed today. Otherwise, thank you.
Thanks, guys.